Hey everybody, this is the preface introduction to the French New Left in Intellectual History from Sartre to Gorz. I believe that's how you pronounce that guy's name. This is from 1981. So here we go. Let's read the table of contents first. Table of contents. Preface, and then part 1 of the book is titled Intellectual Origins of the French New Left. Introduction. Chapter 1 is titled The Leftist Critique of Marxism in Postwar France, with the headings Traditional Marxism in Postwar France, Sources of Renewal, with the subheadings Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Marx's Paris Manuscripts of 1844. The third section is titled The New Themes. Chapter 2 is titled Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, The Existentialist Challenge. Heading 1, Introduction, Sartre's Rise to Prominence. Heading 2, Sartre's Existentialist Social Theory. Heading 3, Simone de Beauvoir, Existentialism and Feminism. Heading 4, Le Temps Moderne and Existentialist Politics. Heading 5, Sartre and the Origins of the French New Left. Chapter 3 is titled Sartre's Critique of Marxism, with the headings Heading 1, Introduction, Marxism and Existentialism. Heading 2, Mediations and the Progressive-Regressive Method. Mediations and the Progressive-Regressive Method. Heading 3, The Dialectic. Heading 4, A Social Ontology of Alienation. Heading 5, Social Being, Series and Groups. Heading 6, The Critique and New Left Social Theory. Chapter 4 is titled Lefebvre and French Revisionism. Marxist Question, Marxism. The headings are Introduction, with the subheadings A, 1956, Year of Transition, B, Sources of Theoretical Revision. Heading 2 is titled Arguments, or Argument, like the journal Argument with I guess that is Lefebvre isn't affiliated with that, but also people like who are the people that he talked about in Christos Mamus talked about in his book, Papaiouanou and Axelos. I can't remember Papaiouanou's first name. I think that's how you pronounce his name, but it's Kostas Axelos. I think they were both Argument people. Anyway. Heading 3, Henri Lefebvre, Communist Philosopher. Heading 4, Rethinking of Marx, The Rethinking of Marx. Heading 5, The Critique of Everyday Life. Heading 6, Lefebvre and the French New Left. Chapter 5 is titled Castoriadis and Socialisme Barbarie, The Gauchiste Rejection of Marxism, with the headings 1, Introduction, 2, Overview, 3, Critique of Bureaucracy, 4, Self-Management, 5, The Rejection of Marxism. Part 2 of the book is titled May 1968, and Chapter 6 is titled From Origins to Culmination, with the headings 1, May 1968, New Left Apocalypse. Heading 2, Sartre, Lefebvre, Castoriadis in May 1968. Heading 3, Limitations of the New Left Social Theory. Heading 4, May 1968, The Turning Point. Part 5 of the book is part 3 of the book is titled Beyond May 68, The Legacy of the French New Left. Chapter 7 is titled Althusser and the Resurgence of Structuralist Marxism, with the headings 1, Introduction, 2, Althusser's Problematic, 3, Theoretical Anti-Humanism, 4, Althusser and the PCF, 5, Althusser's Stalinism. Chapter 8 is titled Eurocommunism and the Crisis of Marxism, with the headings Introduction, The Rise of Eurocommunism, 2, Palantis and the Theory of Eurocommunism, A, Introduction, B, Theory of the Capitalist State, C, Retreat from Structuralism. Heading 3, The New Philosophers. Heading 4, The Crisis of Marxism. Chapter 9 is titled The New Social Movements of the 1970s, with the headings 1, Self-Management, 2, Simone de Beauvoir and the New French Feminism, 3. Political Ecology and the, quote, Greening of Andre Gorz. Epilogue, Marxism and Autonomous Society. Ew. Fun final epilogue title. Preface. This study is not a history of the New Left itself, but rather its theoretical dimensions as it evolved in its most developed form, i.e. in France. For it is in France that the intellectual origins of the New Left social theory, are most obvious in the work of Jean-Paul Sartre and others. And it is also in France that the clearest political expression of the New Left occurred, the May 1968 upheaval. Thus, an intellectual history of the French New Left covers a rich field of experience. It surveys the efforts by radical social theorists both to confront the historically experienced limitations of Marxism as a liberating social theory and to continue and extend the critical role of Marxism by analyzing the new contradictions engendered in advanced industrial societies as well as proposing strategies for liberating social change. The study begins in part 1 with a critical appraisal of the intellectual origins of the French New Left social theory as it emerged from the radical critiques of traditional Marxism carried out by Sartre, Henri Lefebvre, and Cornelius Castoriadis in the period of 1945 to 1968. Sartre's existentialist critique revolved around what he considered to be the lack of Marxist theory of subjectivity. Lefebvre's revisionist critique questioned the validity of the traditional Marxist view of advanced industrial society. Castoriadis' gauchiste critique denied Marxism revolutionary status, claiming it had been transformed into a bureaucratic ideology. Gauchiste is French for leftist, if you did not know. It looks like gauchist, but it's gauchiste, I believe that's how you say it. I think you say CH's with like a sh sound. Anyway, the existentialist, the revisionist, and the gauchiste critiques developed in the late 1940s and 1950s and converged in the 1960s as a French New Left social theory. Its main themes focused on the project of discovering egalitarian solutions to the problems of alienation and bureaucracy in advanced industrial society. The explosion of May 1968, which is discussed in Part 2, appeared to confirm the relevance of this project and opened a new era of social contestation. In this sense, May 1968 was an important turning point. It represented the culmination of New Left social theory and opened the way for incorporation of its assumptions and themes into the political and social movements of the 1970s. In Part 3, I survey the legacy of the French New Left in the aftermath of May 1968. On the one hand, we witness the resurgence of structuralism in the domain of theory and the rise of Euro-communism and left electoralism in the political arena, but more significantly, the social movements of self-management, feminism, and ecology emerged to continue the New Left project and expand its meaning. It is toward these movements, I argue, that radical social theory must turn if it is to move beyond its present fragmentation and confusion to achieve a coherent vision capable of inspiring progressive social change. As an essay in intellectual history, this work does not claim to be exhaustive of all the material which could conceivably be classified under the heading of the French New Left. Rather, I have attempted to select what I think are the basic themes and to develop them in the context of a broad survey of recent French social theory. It is hoped that the result of such an approach is a work that may be of use for the general reader as well as for specialists in social theory and intellectual history. At this point, I would like to thank a number of people who helped me with this project. George Allen introduced me to social philosophy and the issues involved in this book when I was an undergraduate. My dissertation advisor, W. Warren Wagar, and Paul Brynis both gave me the intellectual and moral support I needed in recent years to see this task through. Paul Brynis, he wrote a book with I think it's Andrew Arato on the birth of Western Marxism, or about the influence of Lukács, the young Lukács of the 1920s on social theory. Anyway, Mary Leah, my editor at South End Press, was very supportive and helpful in preparing the final manuscript for publication. I think South End Press, I'm not sure. I feel like that was might have been like a Boston libertarian socialist press, but I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. I think I'm right though, because I'm seeing some of these names and they're looking kind of familiar. I also benefited from discussions with many others, including Michael Albert, Jim Alvino, Jean Agnew, Kathy Campbell, John Harris, Lovie Hemphill, John Krim, John Liffman, Priscilla Offenhauer, John Schneer, and Jerome Wheeler. Debbie Harris typed a portion of the manuscript. Boston University and the Boston College History Department both gave support to this study, but most of all I'm indebted to my wife Elizabeth, whose love, friendship, and personal example are the sources of inspiration out of which this book was created. I wish I had a wife. Well, I wouldn't be so sad. Just kidding. It'd be a bad move for her. Anyway. Part 1. Intellectual Origins of the French New Left. I'm going to read the introduction here, or whatever the first chapter is. Introduction. Marxism arose as a social theory in the 1840s in the context of rapid industrialization accompanied by revolutionary social upheaval. Intellectually, it represented a synthesis of German dialectical philosophy, British political economy, and French theories of socialism with the age-old moral eschatology of the oppressed. It was the first coherent social philosophy to convincingly unite a social morality with a social epistemology, i.e. to link the demands for social justice of the proletariat to a scientific class analysis of capitalist society. This synthesis of science and morality, of knowledge and values, is the basis of the strength and resilience of Marxism as a social theory. Historically, however, the political movements inspired by Marxism have failed to maintain this synthesis. Through a one-sided emphasis on the scientific nature of Marxism, 20th century Marxist movements have failed to develop the egalitarian and democratic kernel of the theory. On the other hand, many critics of Marxism in the revolutionary movement have one-sidedly emphasized the moral aspect of the social problem to the point of denying the efficacy of a scientific approach per se to social theory. The practical results of such an orientation, however, have been equally disastrous. When the explosive force of moral outrage lacks a clear theoretical analysis and organizational strategy, this force quickly dissipates in disillusionment and despair. Thus the fundamental dilemma of revolutionary social theory. Either the moral values of social justice and an egalitarian social order are sacrificed in the process of creating a scientifically organized social structure needed to defend them, or else they are sacrificed by not creating such structures to defend them for fear that structures will become oppressive. Resignation or opting out has not proven a viable alternative to this dilemma, since the crises of advanced industrial society remain unsolved and inescapable. Since 1945, a critical reevaluation of Marxism has taken place for the purpose of developing revolutionary social theory toward a new synthesis in which the scientific and moral aspects are united. In post-war France, this critical reevaluation of Marxism as a revolutionary social theory relevant to the crises of advanced industrial society was carried out in a somewhat unique situation. One second, I think I gotta get... Oh, fuck it, I'll look at the notes later. The existence of a mass communist movement deeply rooted in the working class was a strong argument for the viability of traditional orthodox Marxist theory. Nevertheless, a significant section of the leftist intelligentsia, who indeed were sympathetic to this movement, preferred to maintain a reserved posture of critical support. Jean-Paul Sartre, with his fellow existentialists grouped around the journal Le Temps Moderne, was the center of this important trend. In fact, in the immediate post-war period, existentialism was the only real alternative to the Marxism advanced by the communists. Instead of viewing Sartre merely as a hesitant ally, the communists considered him and existentialism a competitor cutting into their potential support. The communist criticism of this existentialism was quite extensive and often very bitter. The dialogue proved beneficial, however, in that it forced Sartre to develop a more rigorous critique of Marxism as he simultaneously assimilated much of it. Sartre's existentialist critique of traditional Marxism revolved around what he considered to be the lack of a Marxist theory of subjectivity, which in turn distorted its theory of consciousness per se. Sartre's evolution of a, quote, existential Marxism was the fundamental development in the post-war reevaluation of Marxism in France. Within the communist movement itself, A crisis of Marxist theory emerged after the 1956 events, Khrushchev's revelations of Stalin's crimes, the Soviet invasion of Hungary, and the obvious lack of a real de-Stalinization were too much for a number of French communist intellectuals to accept. Consequently, they quit or were expelled from the party, and attempted to revise Marxism in order to account for the changes occurring in advanced industrial society. They founded a journal, Argument, in which they developed their criticism of Marxism and its relevance to an analysis of modern society. Henri Lefebvre, the leading revisionist theorist, argued that the Marxist methodology was still applicable to an analysis of advanced industrial society, but that the categories of analysis had to be revised to account for changes in social structure and structures of consciousness. A third tendency on the post-war French left critical of Marxist theory were the gauchistes. These were the political activists who viewed the communist movement as a conservative bureaucratic machine working toward integrating the working class into the status quo. They traced the origins of this bureaucratic conservatism to Marxist theory itself, which they viewed as the theory of the bourgeois revolution. The journal Socialissimo Barbarie was the focal point of this critique, and Cornelius Castoriadis was its leading spokesman. The existentialist, the revisionist, and the gauchiste critiques of Marxism developed in the late 1940s and 1950s and more or less converged in the 1960s as a French New Left social theory. This social theory rejects capitalist reform, socialist, and communist social systems, as well as the social theories that justify them. Social inequality, elitist authoritarian hierarchy, and repressive manipulation are seen as the common coordinates of bureaucratic determination which lie behind the ideological mystifications buttressing each of these systems. In place of such structures, New Left social theory posits the possibility of an egalitarian society free of the alienation characteristic of contemporary bureaucratic society. The French social upheaval of May 1968 revealed the inability of the traditional Marxist Communist Party leadership to understand, let alone deal in a creative fashion with this unprecedented type of social crisis. For the themes of this crisis were the very ones examined by the party's New Left critics: the revolt against alienation in a bureaucratic society and the demand for control over one's own life, autogestion. However, the May 1968 explosion and its aftermath also revealed the limitations of New Left social theory. Not only was no social transformation forthcoming, but even worse, the New Leftists failed to formulate viable conceptions of how such a transformation could take place. Nevertheless, New Left social theory contains elements of a highly dynamic analysis of advanced industrial society. In Part 1, we will examine the intellectual origins of French New Left social theory as it emerged from the leftist critique of traditional Marxism and attempt to pinpoint its limitations. Chapter 1, The Leftist Critiques of Marxism in Post-War France. Section 1, Traditional Marxism in Post-War France. The term, quote, traditional Marxism refers to the general body of Marxist literature. It consists of those works in which Marx's ideas have been propagated and popularized, from textbooks to political pamphlets to newspaper articles. Thus, while few Marxists have read all 3 volumes of Marx's Capital, many have read Engels' summaries of it, his Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and his Anti-Düring. These and other works by Engels set forth the basic insight and conclusions of Marxist thought in a simple, clear, and summary fashion. However, they leave out the intellectual ferment and the process by which these ideas developed. Marx's vision of the world was that of a dynamic dialectical totality which encompassed several of the latter-day academic disciplines: philosophy, history, politics, economics, and sociology. But the Marxism which Engels taught the leaders of the Second International was primarily concerned with the economic analysis of capitalism and its scientific character. The Hegelian origins of Marxist thought were quietly abandoned, as well as their revolutionary consequences. Only the, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, of the latter Marx was emphasized. The later Marx was emphasized. The Marxism of the Second International, 1889 to 1914, was a peculiar blend of positivism and evolutionism. It espoused a scientific economic determinism rooted in mechanistic materialism. Philosophical questions were not broached, for it was considered that Marx had long before disposed of philosophy by transcending it, overcoming it in the direction of science. I would say that this is not precisely true, unless you take the Marxists at their word, that what they were not doing when they were talking about so-called dialectical materialism, a term coined by Plekhanov, that they weren't doing philosophy, they were doing something else. I personally think they were doing philosophy. They were doing, and not only philosophy, they were doing metaphysics. They were talking about the central core aspects of the cosmos, in a way, and kind of using as opposed to like a straight up metaphysics where it would have just been kind of based upon like intellectual like rigor and like thinking through your ideas about thinking through logically, without scientific recourse, without empirical recourse, without investigation using your sensory apparatus, deducing what is necessarily true about the universe, right? That's what like Descartes would have done in his project, right? Whereas they kind of did what you would refer to, what like those classical metaphysics would do, is like just kind of base their theories totally upon like intuition, not in like that kind of like, or not intuition, what's the word, introspection of their ideas and like what logically must be the case. Whereas the dialectical materialists and people who kind of like harp on about that did essentially the same, very much the same thing, but they would, instead of just using pure logical rigor, they'd use like examples from science to demonstrate like what they were saying, and like making universal claims by that. And they called what they were doing not metaphysics. One of the things that you find when you hear like Marxists in this period talk about metaphysics, what they mean is metaphysics that's not dialectical, right? So like a metaphysical an assertion about like the world being in constant flux, right? That's an assertion about the nature of the world, which is a metaphysical assertion. When they say metaphysics, they mean people who think there's kind of like they kind of think of it more in terms of like more in the sense of like maybe like the most extreme example would be like Plato, right? Who talked about like these timeless forms and talked about things without really having too much of a scientific basis. So that's why you can have things like dogmatic Marxism, because it's like it doesn't register what it's doing as like a metaphysical enterprise. It says what it's doing is just like science, and science has this kind of like objective kind of weight behind it, whereas metaphysics ostensibly does not. But what they're doing are fundamentally metaphysics. So they use metaphysics in a very strange way. They say like, when they say metaphysics, they just mean like metaphysics of like being, as opposed to like metaphysics of becoming, is basically what they mean by that. Check out the books I have about the history of like dialectical materialism on this channel. They're very interesting. Anyway, this Marxism of the Second International, 1889 to 1914, was a peculiar blend. Oh, sorry, the other thing I meant to say is that, so there was a lot of philosophical discussion, and I think this is most evident. It seems like, whereas, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm talking out my asshole, but it seems like, even because it's not strictly true, but a lot of, what was I going to say? A lot of the philosophical heavy lifting that was going on, or like the philosophical discussion, was happening in Russia. And I'm sure there's all kinds of sociological reasons why you could say that, because it wasn't quite a bourgeois society yet. There was still a high prevalence of like deference towards church authority, and deference towards like kind of very mythic things, to what's the word, as opposed to say maybe like Germany, which obviously very a religious society as well, but probably more secular. Anyway, but they did a lot of philosophizing. I would say that Russian Marxists did a lot of philosophizing. Whereas people like Rosa Luxemburg, like her main text would have been like her journalistic work, or her essayistic work, or political essays or political interventions. But like her main theoretical contribution to Marxism was the accumulation of capital, as opposed to say like Lenin, right, who's like one of his like big texts. Obviously he did other things. He has a book on like the development of capitalism in Russia, but also like one of his big books, which is way more well known, is like Imperiomonism. So I mean, materialism and imperial. How's it fucking go? Can't think of it. Materialism and Imperial Criticism, I think, is the proper title of the title is eluding my mind. Where the so-called like copy theory of knowledge was developed. That was way more like, it seems like, and like, so like the Lenins and the Plekhanovs, and then other people within Russian Marxism seemed way more interested in those kind of like philosophical questions, as opposed to just those, as opposed to like social science. Obviously, both were interested in each, but it seems like philosophy was big in Russia. Right? And it's kind of like a twisted. It's an interesting thing, is because like Western Marxism, which is ostensibly a critique, and I think it is a critique, both the Second International Marxism, but also the way the Second International Marxism, with its this what the words used here, that's positivism and evolutionism, were kind of like transmuted into post 1917 communism, and the, I guess, Third International Marxism. But Western Marxism, the places that they would have been intervening in, I don't think were particularly big philosophical. Like, philosophy didn't seem particularly important in those areas prior to that period. But I might be talking out my ass. Sorry. Feeling chatty. Philosophical questions were not broached, for it was considered that Marx had long before disposed of philosophy by transcending it, overcoming it in the direction of science. In the Revolution versus Reform debates of the Second International, basic philosophical agreement on a scientific positivism was evident in the arguments of both Bernstein and Kautsky. Even Lenin's reflection theory of consciousness, i.e. consciousness is nothing more than a reflection of being, was rooted in a mechanistic materialism. Thus the, quote, scientific trend of traditional Marxism goes back through Lenin, Kautsky, and Engels even to the last years of Marx himself. In France, Marxism was conditioned by two further circumstances: its late introduction and its identification with Stalinism. Marxism was assimilated in France very slowly, for it had to compete with all the rich varieties of French revolutionary and socialist thought, Jacobinism, Blanchism, Proudhon's theories, and syndicalism, etc. Yeah, so if you read, if you listen to the things I have on here by Althusser, like his introduction to Reading Capital, but also the book that I have on Althusser, by what's his name, Gregory Eliot, The Detour of Theory, which is a very good book. I mean, whether you like Althusser or not, it's a very good intellectual history. I found it very interesting read. He talks about how there really isn't kind of a Marxist intellectual tradition in France. How prior to 1945 there was a lot of dominance of it was very the Marxism of, if this makes sense, the Marxism of France was, prior to the 50s and 60s, was very philosophical in nature. Not philosophical, political in nature, as opposed to theoretical or philosophical, right? So one of the big names would, that was one of the things that he mentions in his book, in both of his books. Althusser talks about it, Eliot talks about it. So let's see what it also said. Moreover, the initial followers of Marx of the 1880s, Jules Gued, Paul Lafargue, Charles Longuet, did not have a very good grasp of Marx's thought. In fact, it was in reference to some of these French Marxists that Marx himself facetiously remarked, quote, "I am not a Marxist." Intellectually, Marxism was introduced to France under the rather unlikely circumstances. The scholar Lucien Hare was able to bring Marxism to France's intellectual elite in his capacity of librarian at the École Normale Supérieure. It was under Hare's guidance that Jean Jaurès turned to socialism and Marxism. While Lucien Hare initiated the Normalines into Marxist theory, it was Georges Sorel who, through his analysis of the Italians, Croce and Labriola, brought Marxism to a larger audience in the 1890s. Nevertheless, prior to World War I, Marxist theory was still only partially assimilated, to the extent that Jaurès, its leading French advocate, could claim his socialist inspiration jointly from Marx, Michelet, and Plutarch! This lack of intellectual assimilation, however, did not immediately affect the political growth of the French socialist movement, but it may account for some of its problems. World War II and the Bolshevik Revolution unleashed a revolutionizing shock throughout Europe. In France, the majority of socialists endorsed the October Revolution and formed a communist party in 1920. First, Lenin's and then Stalin's political theories dominated French communist thought. And it'll be said that like a lot of the people who the reason that they dominated thought is because people who rejected them were either kicked out or pressured out. So people, um, you know, so like um, Korsch and Lukács. Um, Lukács recanted. I don't think Korsch did or had to. Korsch was kind of like he was definitely like a pretty mainstream communist politician at this point in 1923. So it wasn't quite before he had like left the KPD and got involved with the KAPD, the Left Communist Party of Germany at that time. Um, but yeah, like there was like reasons that they were pressured out, right? Um, it wasn't just because they like kind of like won the intellectual day or were just like the most popular or whatever that certain theories won out in others. There was definitely always a political dimension of like bullying um, that kind of set the stage. Of Marx's works, only Capital, the Communist Manifesto, and his political histories were translated into French before World War I. His early works, including the crucial Paris manuscripts of 1844, were not translated until 1937 and then didn't have any real impact after 1945. It wasn't until 1929 that the first group of Marxist intellectuals, it wasn't until 1929 that the first group of Marxist intellectuals was constituted for the specific purpose of studying and propagating Marxist theory. The most significant philosophical work produced by a member of this group was Paul Nizan in the book Les Chiens du Garde. But this was not a treatise on Marxist philosophy so much as a damning attack on non-Marxist philosophy. During the 1930s, Nizan and the other French communist intellectuals viewed the communist movement as the only hope of human salvation in a capitalist world threatened by war, depression, and fascism. In such a Manichaean political context, philosophy was viewed as an instrumental weapon to be used by one side or the other. This atmosphere hardly encouraged a critical examination of one's own philosophical assumptions. During the, quote, heroic years of the Popular Front and the resistance, there was, quote, no time for philosophical analyses, for the immediate political tasks were all-consuming. Marxist theory, therefore, did not really begin to develop in France until after the liberation. Post-1945 French Marxism was even more explicitly scientistic and positivistic than that of the Second International. The leading Marxist theoretical journal, La Pensée Revue du Rationalisme Moderne, was put out by prominent intellectuals and scientists associated with the Parti Communiste Français, French Communist Party. The leading scientists had an openly positivistic approach to Marxism, a worldview which they considered to be the contemporary form of scientific rationalism. They viewed themselves as heirs of the materialism of Diderot and the French encyclopedist tradition of the 18th century Enlightenment. French Marxism was further limited in the immediate post-war years by the political situation. The Popular Front, the resistance, and the defeat of fascism created an atmosphere pregnant with great hopes for socialist revolution. The communists and socialists won an electoral majority, social welfare legislation was passed, and major financial and industrial enterprises were nationalized. Even that last bastion of reaction, male chauvinism, was slightly jolted as French women finally won the right to vote. For a short time, 1944 to 1947, it appeared that the French might finally fulfill their revolutionary tradition. But the outbreak of the Cold War in 1947 shattered the political unity of the left as the PCF was excluded from the government. In 1947, the PCF was a political party claiming close to 1 million members and the electoral choice of over 5 million mostly working-class French voters. Basking in the prestige of its resistance record, its obvious working-class support, and its Marxist legacy, the PCF exercised a strong attraction on leftist and liberal intellectuals. It was a political party which confidently claimed to be in sole possession of a philosophically rigorous and scientific theory of history and society. It was a party that claimed to fight for social justice and for the downtrodden and progress for all. And despite its many shortcomings, it was a party that compared quite favorably with the other political groupings of the post-war period. However, anti-communists emphasized the special relationship between the Soviet Union and the PCF and argued that the latter functioned as a fifth column doing the bidding of an aggressive and hostile foreign power. It seems like that's true. whether you agree with that project, it does seem like that is actually the case. They also pointed to the dictatorial nature of the communist movement and claimed that the social justice ideology was merely a window dressing to cover up the brutal machinations of a totalitarian police state seeking to conquer the entire world. The communists, for their part, replied in kind to such charges. It was the United States that was bent on world domination, and supporters in France hid behind the facade of democratic ideology to cover up their role as, quote, agents of Wall Street and, quote, and world capitalism. It's not surprising that a cultural and intellectual polarization accompanied this political polarization. French communists argued that since the Soviet Union was the first socialist state, it was the duty of socialists everywhere to protect it from attack by its capitalist enemies. Marxist intellectuals felt a deep moral commitment to defend the Soviet Union and demonstrate the superiority of its social system over that of the capitalist West. This doctrine of the two camps shackled Marxist intellectuals in ideological constraints that virtually precluded a critical approach to Marxist theory. Thus, French Marxism came to be identified completely with the Soviet Union and the, quote, thought of Joseph Stalin. The French Stalinist version of Marxism was that of a static, closed, finished philosophy known as dialectical materialism. Following Stalin's example, as presented in the Catechism, where the hell? It was presented in the catechismic form of a sacred text consisting of 7 theses, 3 principles, and 4 traits. This dialectical materialism is a gross caricature of Marx's thought. Its dialectic affirmed the universality of contradiction, but the chief example used to illustrate its operation were all mechanical, e.g. positive and negative numbers in mathematics, action and reaction in mechanics, the combination and dissociation of atoms in chemistry. Its materialism consisted primarily of the undigested assertion that matter is primary and mind a, quote, reflection of matter, only secondary. Its historical materialism was little more than an evolutionary economic determinist view of history and society. The economic base entirely determined the political cultural superstructure of society. Any kind of autonomy and superstructure from base was denounced as illusory. Stalinist diamat ignored most of the social and economic developments of the 20th century and reiterated Marx's analyses of mid-19th century Europe. Capitalist society was depicted as a battleground between two monolithic classes, bourgeoisie and proletariat, locked in mortal combat. Economic crisis was considered endemic to capitalism, and the French working class was depicted as suffering increased pauperization. Armed with the, quote, truth of dialectical materialism as rendered by Stalin, the PCF would lead the working class out of this land of the capitalist pharaohs and into the socialist promised land. The party was the sole arbiter of this quote, truth. It always had the correct line on every subject. Those who chose to interpret Marxism differently from the party line were considered heretics and traitors to the working class. Thus, French Marxism was frozen into the Stalinist mold. We're talking about pre-1956, so pre-Khrushchev's speech here, but like, there's this tension. I was listening to Gregory Elliott's book the other day, and it seems like there's very much this tension, this thing that I don't really see. He was like basically kind of saying more or less that Marxist humanism had become like the new like dominant thing that Althusser was like butting up against. So like I guess like Sartre, but also like I guess people that were influenced more by like Gramsci. But it seems to me, if you read like other things like the work of Irving Fetcher, for instance, how much within international communism as a whole, they very much despise the humanist reading. So people like Adam Schaff, who was like a theoretician in the Polish Communist Party, was very much an outlier in his humanism, in his humanistic interpretation of Marx. Anyway, sorry, that's just a thought. Where the hell am I? Many leftist intellectuals who are politically sympathetic to the working class and socialism found this mental machinery deeply disturbing. For not only was Stalinism intellectually constraining, but the expression of any reservations or disagreements with it was greeted with intense hostility and suspicion. The party claimed for itself the exclusive right to determine the form and content of Marxist theory. But the Stalinist Marxism which the PCF espoused was incapable of confronting the new situation of post-war France. Whatever the validity of the writings of Marx, Engels, or Lenin, the PCF refused to recognize the empirical changes taking place in French society right under its nose. such as the rise of consumer society and the welfare state. The party chose to repeat the old slogans and incantations without even infusing them with new content. Many leftist intellectuals therefore sought other resources to, quote, thaw out Marxism so that it could be made relevant to the problems facing society. New section, Section 2, Sources of Renewal. What this task involved is a rethinking of the intellectual roots of Marxism via return to Hegel and the early works of Marx, the resulting discovery of the Hegelian dialectic and Marx's early conception of alienation demonstrated the inadequacies of Stalinism as a valid philosophical interpretation of Marxism. I'm sure he'll talk about this in just like 5 seconds, but reading the other book on this subject, on the intellectual history of the left. There's another intellectual history, Mark Poster's book, Existentialist Marxism in France, I think it's called, but it's another intellectual history of French thought. And the two people that are really important in this period are Alexandre Kojève and Jean Hippolyte, who kind of introduce, I think pretty basic, fundamentally introduce Hegel into French intellectual life, where it hadn't been there really before. This is kind of like a new thing. And then obviously Nietzsche kind of comes into the picture by the end of I think in the early 60s. Whenever Gilles Deleuze writes his book on Nietzsche. Anyway, here we go. Subheading A, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Prior to the 1930s, Hegel was ignored for the most part by French intellectuals. The narrow intellectual provincialism so prevalent in pre-1940 France partially accounts for this apparent lack of interest. However, the devastating defeat of 1940 shattered much of this long-standing smug, self-complacent cultural chauvinism. The collapse of the pre-war certainties combined with the resistance's promise of spiritual renewal broke down much of the intellectual barriers to these things foreign. Thus, after the war, an unprecedented revival of Hegel's study burst forth upon the French intellectual scene. The groundwork for this, quote, Hegel Renaissance was laid in the 1930s by Alexandre Kojève, a Russian émigré, and Jean Hippolyte. I feel like I've heard, maybe this is wrong, but I've heard that someone's made. I feel like I've heard the suspicion somewhere that Alexandre Kojève was some kind of Russian agent of some kind, or some Stalinist agent. But I can't be quite sure if that's true or not. So just know that that's something I've heard, not something I know. More than anyone else, these two philosophers molded the French perception of Hegel. From 1933 to 1939, Kojève lectured regularly at the École Pratique des Hautes Études on Hegel's book Phenomenology of Spirit. Among those regularly attending were Raymond Aron, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, R.P. Fessard, Raymond Queneau, Jean de Sainty, Georges Bataille, and Jacques Lacan, all prominent figures in post-war intellectual life. In 1947, Queneau collected and edited the notebooks of many who attended the lectures and published them with an article and note from Kojève. Jean Hippolyte, a philosopher teaching at the Sorbonne and later at the Collège de France, wrote articles on Hegel in the late 1930s, but more significantly, Jean Hippolyte published the first complete and definitive French translation of Hegel's Phenomenology in 1941. After the war, he published several important commentaries on Hegel as well. Kojève's lectures and notes and Hippolyte's translation and commentaries were the basic sources by which the French experienced Hegel. Their concentration on the phenomenology of spirit, published originally in 1807, made Hegel appear not as the dogmatic idealist associated with his later works of the 1820s, but rather as a dynamic critical founder of a philosophical anthropology. By making the master-slave dialectic the focus of his analysis, Kojève laid the basis for a Marxist reading of Hegel, which emphasized class struggle. Hippolyte, on the other hand, chose to emphasize the theme of the, quote, unhappy consciousness, end quote, which experiences despair and anguish over its finitude and mortality. This theme was at the root of the existentialist reading of Hegel. Both of these readings found a common ground in Hegel's historical concept of reason. Traditional French rationalism viewed reason and its categories as eternally valid. Hegel, on the other hand, argued that reason was not absolute and in its structure, but dialectical. That is, different forms of human consciousness emerged from the contradictions of preceding forms of consciousness. For example, the scientific and rationalist forms of consciousness in 17th and 18th century Europe. Hegel argued, grew out of the contradictions of medieval religious forms of consciousness. The forms of human consciousness throughout history reflected the development of human efforts to posit being in the world and then comprehend the results of this action. Merleau-Ponty, one of Kojel's famous students, put it this way, quote, Hegel's thought, ... views man as not being from the start a consciousness of its own clear thoughts. Quote, Hegel's thought views man not as being from the start a consciousness of its own clear thoughts, but as a life which is its own responsibility. But as a life which is its own responsibility and which tries to understand itself. All of the phenomenology of spirit describes man's efforts to reappropriate himself, end quote. Gorz. This notion of the historical conditioning of reason served as an antidote to the traditional tenets of French rationalism and French Marxism, for the clear implication was that these reigning dogmas were not absolute in their validity, as each claimed, but rather a specific stage in the totalizing movement of consciousness. Hippolyte himself put it this way, quote, for the French, Hegel's vision of the world ... is indispensable to know. According to Hegel, history and reason interpenetrate one another ... It is with history that we must reconcile ourselves. Freedom is precisely this reconciliation. Our philosophers have thought about freedom in an entirely different way. From Descartes to Bergson, our philosophy is a refusal of history. Rather, it is dualist, looking for freedom in a reflection of the subject on himself. End quote. Hippolyte. Hegel used the dialectic as a method of phenomenologically describing the historical forms of reason as they appeared. Truth for Hegel was the whole, the unity of all the various historical manifestations of reason and their simultaneous comprehension by the individual, subject, the unity of substance, of reason, and subject he considered, quote, absolute knowledge, end quote. From this absolute standpoint, the dialectical development of specific modes of consciousness appears as partial, and since the, quote, truth is the whole, end quote, these partial truths pale into insignificance. It is from this line of thought that the dogmatic idealism associated with Hegel's later works derived. The French reading of Hegel, however, discounted his claim to absolute knowledge and the dogmatic dialectic which accompanies it. Both Kojève and Hippolyte chose to emphasize the critical dialectic of negativity, the process by which the, quote, partial truths of consciousness superseded one another. This inevitably led to a similar attitude toward traditional Marxism, a rejection of the dogmatic results of Marx's inquiry, and a return to Marx's critical method. B. Marx's Paris Manuscripts of 1844. It is not surprising, then, that when French intellectuals turned to a reading of Marx's early works, they found that he himself followed a similar intellectual journey. When Marx's Paris Manuscripts of 1844 finally came to the attention of French intellectuals a century later, they rediscovered how the 26-year-old Marx had rejected Hegel's absolute while retaining his dialectic of negativity. They also rediscovered a concretized concept of alienation. Quote, the outstanding achievement of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, the dialectic of negativity as the movement and creating principle, is first, that Hegel grasps the self-creation of man as a process, objectification as loss of the object, as alienation and transcendence of this alienation, and that he therefore grasps the nature of labor and conceives objective man as the result of his own labor. End quote. And I'm not sure who that quote is from. Anyway, moving on. Alienation is the central theme of both Hegel's Phenomenology and Marx's Paris Manuscripts. For Hegel, objectification was the source of alienation. Estrangement from oneself occurred because one's inner feelings were not recognized as one's own reality by others. Instead, individuals objectify each other and thereby objectify themselves, view themselves from the outside. Consequently, a struggle for recognition ensues whereby individuals attempt to express their inner selves by creating objects which can be recognized by others. Even so, there is no guarantee that others will recognize these objects as they were intended. In fact, they almost certainly won't, laying the foundation for the next stage of alienation. Thus, alienation is rooted in the dilemma of objectification. No objectification implies no recognition of self. Yet objectification, because it is objectification, implies a distorted recognition of self. In the Paris Manuscripts, Marx develops this concept of alienation one step further. For Marx, it is not just the objectification of self and the products of one's labor that is central to alienation, but also the appropriation of these objects by another. Hegel's dialectic is a dialectic of alienation of self experienced as, quote, spirit. Marx concretizes this dialectic and thus transforms it into a dialectic of the material alienation of labor. With the discovery of the Paris manuscripts, alienation was resurrected as a fundamental Marxist concept. It served as a focal point for the leftist critique of traditional Marxism. The existentialists... Excuse me, I lost my spot. Fuck. One second. Shit. Alright, I might have to reread something. In the Paris manuscripts, Marx develops his concept of alienation one step further. For him, it is not just the objectification of self and the products of one's labor that is central to alienation, but also the appropriation of these objects by another. Hegel's dialectic is a dialectic of alienation of self experienced as, quote, spirit. Marx concretizes this dialectic and thus transforms it into a dialectic of the material alienation of labor. With the discovery of the Paris manuscripts, alienation was resurrected as a fundamental Marxist concept. It served as the focal point for the leftist critique of traditional Marxism. The existentialists, the revisionists, and the gauchistes all assimilated Marx's Paris manuscripts and cited them as an authority for their various criticisms of Stalinism. Stalinist intellectuals were caught unawares by this early Marx revival buttressed by the Hegel Renaissance. Prior to this time, they had rebuffed all sorts of attacks on the orthodoxy of their Marxism. In the writings of the young Marx himself, they faced a formidable opponent. One can say that the Paris manuscripts revealed a Marx very different from the orthodox version. In post-1945 France, the Paris manuscripts had the impact of an intellectual bombshell. Leftist intellectuals felt they had discovered a telling critique of Stalinism, for it appeared that Marx himself had envisioned the emergence of a dehumanizing, quote, crude communism, end quote, and indeed this is how the leftist critics viewed Stalinism in uncannily prophetic terms. Stalinist intellectuals, for their part, maintained an embarrassed silence or else dismissed Marx's youthful philosophical speculation as, quote, immature, and claimed that he himself later rejected it as well. Yeah, that seems like the that seems more of the tune that Irving Fetcher described it. Anyway, Section 3, the new themes. The theme of alienation thus became the rallying point for critics of traditional Marxism. What is wrong with capitalism, they argue, is that it alienated the individual from one's authentic being. Instead of resolving this fundamental problem, Stalinism only compounded it by creating further mystifications. The struggle against alienation in advanced industrial society gradually emerged as the focus of new left social theory. Alienation was seen as particularly characteristic of post-war society because of the increasing growth of bureaucratization. The lack of responsiveness of societal institutions to human needs is perceived as a function of a growing impersonal, atomistic, and anonymous bureaucracy. In this context, the Soviet Union and traditional Marxism were increasingly perceived as a specific variation of the bureaucratic theme. For alienation was acutely apparent in the Soviet bloc as well as in the West. From the late 1940s to the early 1960s, the leftist critics of Marxism focused their analyses on the problems of alienation in modern bureaucratic society. As leftists, they affirmed the need for a socialist solution. However, learning from the Soviet experience, they also emphasized the need for real political and economic democracy. Their egalitarian view of a free society surfaced in May 1968 in the slogan autogestion, or, quote, self-management. In the following chapters, we will trace the development of the three major tendencies among the leftist critics of traditional Marxism in France. In any case, we will first sketch an overview of the terrain and then analyze the critique of traditional Marxism of the major theorists of each tendency. In this process, we will show how each moved from a critique of traditional Marxism to the themes of new left social theory, alienation, bureaucracy, and autogestion. And since I didn't read the foot endnotes, I'm going to have to read them now. 1. The leftist critique of traditional Marxism is of course not unique to France. It is a European-wide phenomenon with worldwide impact. The Frankfurt School in Germany with Marcuse in the US, the Praxis Group in Yugoslavia, Marxist humanism in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and the Italian School of Phenomenological Marxism are all similar in inspiration with the French intellectual currents considered here. I don't know what the original editor of the journal Telos just had a very bizarre history. It still publishes things in critical theory from critical theorists, especially ones that might not get a reception in, for whatever reason, in other journals. But it definitely has had a right-wing turn. I think the guy who runs it now, can't remember his name. I think it's something Pan, might be David Pan or something like that. Is some weird conservative guy. I think he might even run for the Republican Party in the United States. So it has had a weird right-wing turn, and I don't know what the fundamental reason for that is, or how it all went about. But that guy, anyway, the reason I'm bringing that guy up is Paul Piccone, is that he, I think he's one of the people that is associated with this Italian phenomenological Marxism. But I think he might have moved to the United States, but from Italy. Anyway, end footnote. Footnote. For a cogent elaboration of this view, see Marc Poster's book, Existential Marxism in Postwar France, From Sartre to Althusser. Just started reading that. Section 3. For the political and ideological aspects of this crisis, see Francois Feito, The French Communist Party and the Crisis of International Communism, published in 1967. And note 4. The political labels, quote, left, quote, right, etc., have meaning only in specific context. The term, quote, left or, quote, leftist is used in this study. When the term, quote, left or, quote, leftist is used in this study, the implied context is the whole of French society. The term, quote, gauchiste is used in this study to refer to the left within the left. The left within the left. End footnote. Footnote. In the post-May period, the intense preoccupation with developing libertarian organizational forms was symptomatic of the fact that many new leftists were themselves uncertain as to how a liberating social transformation could take place. And footnote. Footnote. Thus, it could be argued that the historical reality of traditional Marxism is not to be found in Marx's work, but rather in Engels' work or Bukharin's ABC of Communism, or even Edward Aveling's The Student's Marx. End footnote. I think Edward Aveling was one of the first translators of, trying to think, Edward Aveling, I think he was one of the first translators of Marx's Capital into English. I think he was also married, or the partner of one of Marx's daughters. I don't know, there's something where one of Marx's daughters' husbands were cheating on them. I think she killed herself, something like that. I don't know, I might be making that totally up, so don't quote me on that. And footnote. Footnote. George Lichtheim, who wrote a big book on Marxism, argues that Marx's life work passed through a number of different phases. He distinguishes between a, quote, pre-Marxist Marx and a Marx who develops after 1860 towards economism. See his book Marxism, 1964. And footnote. Footnote. See Edward Bernstein's Evolutionary Socialism of 1899 and Karl Kautsky's The Road to Power of 1909. Footnote. See Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Isn't that what I said earlier? Is that what I said? I couldn't remember. I think I said materialism and imperial criticism. Maybe I said imperial monism. I don't know. Anyway. And footnote. See a bunch of books in French. Maximilien Rebel's book is noticed. Bibliography of the works of Marx. And George Lichtheim's book, Marxism in Modern France, 1966. And footnote. See Pradeep Bandyopadhyay's article, The Many Faces of French Marxism, published in Science and Society in 1972. See Lichtheim's book, I'm not sure which one, where he says, quote, what passed for Marxism before the 1880s, ... was a mere parody, end quote. And footnote. Footnote. See Harvey Goldberg's book, The Life of Jean Jaurès. Hare was a libertarian. What's his name? I can't remember his first name. Lucien Hare, I think that's what they said earlier. Hare was the librarian at the École Normale Supérieure from 1888 to 1924, and his influence spanned through at least three generations of Marxist intellectuals. And footnote. Footnote. Benedetto Croce is not usually remembered for his Marxism, yet in the 1890s, Croce's writings and those of his teacher Antonio Labriola were considered by Vilfredo Pareto as, quote, indispensable for appreciating the present state of the question of historical materialism, end quote. And that quote is from Pareto, but it's quoted in H. Stuart Hughes' book, Consciousness and Society, published in 1958. For the general significance of these two Italians and their influence in spreading Marxism in France through Georges Sorel, see Hughes and Neil McInnes. Footnote: the theoretical problems of the Second International are too complex and tangential to the present subject to be treated here. For an overview of these problems, see James Joel's book, The Second International, 1889 to 1914. End footnote. Footnote: Marx's most important early writings, the Paris Manuscripts of 1844 and the German Ideology of 1846 and the all-important Grundrisse of 1857 to 58, which shows the continuity between his early and later work, were all unpublished in any language and virtually unknown until the 1930s. German editions of the first two works appeared in 1932 and later in 1939. A French edition of the Grundrisse did not appear until 1967. And footnote. Even the important philosophical works of Lenin and Engels were not translated into French until very late. Lenin's Materialism and Empirical Criticism did not appear in French until 1928, and Engels' book Dialectics of Nature appeared in 1957. Just on the basis of the availability of the text, it appears that a thorough evaluation of Marxist theory was really impossible until the post-war period. And footnote. The Philosophies group was of communist intellectuals functioned as a Marxist study group between 1929 and 1934, although it had been constituted several years earlier. Its members were Georges Politzer, Henri Lefebvre, Norbert Gutterman, Georges Friedman, Pierre Morange, and Paul Nizan. Lefebvre gives a history of the group in his book L'Existentialisme of 1946, and W.F. Redfern discusses it in his book Paul Nizan. End footnote. Lefebvre's Dialectical Materialism of 1939 did not appear until 5 years after the group dispersed. End footnote. Footnote. Founded in 1939, its editors included such distinguished scientists as Frédéric Joliot-Curie, Paul Langevin, Marcel Prenant, and Henri Wallon. I don't know what journal is being referenced here. Footnote. For an excellent analysis of this political situation, see Alexander Wirth's book, Alexander Wirth's book, France, 1940 to 1955, published in 1956. Or footnote. By and far the best studies on the Communist Party of France are Annie Kriegel's, something in French, Origine du communisme français, 1914 to 1920, and Les communistes français, published in 1969. A recent comprehensive study is Ronald Tiersky's book, French Communism, 1920 to 1972, published in 1974. And footnote. Edgar Morin, an ex-communist intellectual who quit after 1956 and participated in the founding of Argument, describes this process as Galiciation in his book Autocritique of 1959. Footnote. See Joseph Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism in his book, in Stalin's Leninism, Selected Writings, published in 1942 in New York. For examples of French diamat, see Roger Garaudy, La théorie matérialiste de la connaissance. Roger Garaudy converted to Islam, became a Holocaust denier in the late 1970s, I believe. Guy Bess and Maurice Kaveling's Principes élémentaires de philosophie. For a broad discussion of the relationship of French intellectuals to the PCF, see David Kaut's book, Communism and the French Intellectuals of 1964, published in 1964, and on Stalin's impact in France, see Alfred J. Reber, Stalin and the French Communist Party, 1941 to 1947. And footnote. Lenin used these examples in his essay titled On the Question of Dialectics of 1915. Stalin and his followers constantly repeated them. And footnote. This may well have been true comparing 1938 living standards with the standards those of 1954, although a clear rise was evident from 1949 to 1954. On the standard of living debate of the French working classes, see Worth, whose book was just cited earlier. And footnote. Apart from the Surrealists and the Philosophies group, there was little intellectual interest in Hegel and almost no academic interest. Footnote. See Lichtheim, who says, after 1945, quote, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Marx, Freud, Weber, Husserl, and Heidegger were assimilated almost simultaneously, end quote. And footnote. For the best account of the post-war Hegel revival, see Poster, Chapter 1, titled The Hegel Renaissance. Poster argues that the emergence of interest in Hegel was directly linked to the expectation of socialism among leftist intellectuals. That chapter I just read the other day, and I'll be up on this channel at some point. Maybe before, maybe after this. Anyway. And footnote. See Merleau-Ponty, Sense and Nonsense, published in English in 1964. Footnote, see Jean Hippolyte, Introduction à la philosophie de l'histoire de Hegel. I don't know if I'm saying any of this right, so it's fun to try to pronounce the words anyway. Footnote, this and the following quotations are from T.B. Baltimore's translation of the Paris Manuscripts and Erich Fromm's Marxist Concepts of Man, published in 1961. Incidentally, before undertaking the Phenomenology, Hegel wrote an extended critique of Adam Smith and the concept of labor of classical political economy. See his Jenensel, Real Philosophy, edited by Johann Hofmeister, 1967. All right, and that's the end of Chapter 1 of The French New Left and Intellectual History from Sartre to Gorz by... Who's this thing by? Forget already. Arthur Hirsch. Would not have remembered that, so it's a good thing I looked back. Thank you so much for listening.